Anyone who collects anything knows very well that the investment of time and money you put into your collection doesn't necessarily stop at the objects you like and collect. There's a whole kind of peripheral set of things that you eventually need to look into, get, figure out, make, but in some kind of way you need to be invested in as well in order to maximize the satisfaction you get from your collection and your knowledge of the things you want to collect. And while this may be true for all collectibles, it's arguably even more true for antiques, because the kind of scope of knowledge you need to have around an antique is not necessarily more broad than for other things people may collect, but the information and the details around what you're collecting may be harder to come by. It's not necessarily the case that you find everything online. And all of this is to say that experienced sword collectors mustn't only budget for swords, but they need to account for display cabinets, for example, or where they're going to store their swords. They need to budget for cleaning and maintenance products. They need to budget for literature, for example. And this is exactly the topic of today's video. As I mentioned, detailed information when it comes to antique collectibles, and especially niche ones like swords maybe, is actually harder to come by than you may think. And this is because even though you see hundreds or thousands of pages online with a lot of really valuable information, and there are very active communities that are ready to answer any question you may have, still the information that is publicly available online is only the tip of the iceberg. The core part of data that you will need as you kind of grow into your collection is actually still stored offline in books. And these books are often out of print, expensive, and produced in very low numbers. So actually being able to build your literature library is an important part of collecting that will go hand in hand with your experience as you grow into your collection. So of course this doesn't mean you need to start your collection with a full library of reference books, but it's more of a warning, especially to beginner collectors, that as you kind of reach the third, fourth, fifth sword, as you kind of get a little more experienced with your hands on the object and you start wanting to look more into the history and the context and the inscriptions and the models and this kind of stuff, you will really quickly outgrow the information that is available online. Or if not outgrow it, you will feel the need to integrate that with some kind of knowledge that isn't as readily available. So in this video, we're going to look at what you could call a few book typologies that may be useful, well, that are useful to me personally, are useful to a whole bunch of other sword collectors as well. And this is meant, of course, specifically for beginner collectors, just to give you an idea of what is out there and how you may want to grow your library as your collection grows as well. Of course, there are no rules here. If you see any book that you like, pick it up, whatever it is. Don't ever feel like indications from someone on YouTube like me need to be followed step by step. This is meant to hopefully just give a little bit of context around the topic of the library of the sword collector and how to get yours started. We'll start kind of from the most simple and basic and move our way up to the things you may want to buy only when you're really into a very specific kind of sword or specific kind of information. So the first thing you'll want to buy is just a generic book about swords. I have two here to show you. One is Swords and Daggers. This is by Edward Wagner. And then I have this one that is by Robert Wilkinson Latham. This is a Dutch version of the book, so it's Edged Weapons in Color, I think. In Dutch it's Blanke Wapens in Kleur. And these are easily available anywhere you may want to find books, and they're very cheap. So with $5 to $10 or euros or pounds, you'll probably be able to pick one of these up or anything similar. So what these are usually are a quick introduction. They'll give you a bunch of introduction to different, well, usually to the structure of a sword, so the different components. You get an idea of lexicon that may be useful for you. Then they usually have a bunch of interesting plates with descriptions. These are usually plates that are either describing a generic typology or specific swords that the author has been able to study and illustrate. They may be illustrated or pictures, this doesn't really matter. And you'll kind of get a general overview of a bunch of different kinds of swords over a different period. And if you're lucky, you'll usually get a bibliography at the back. We don't have one here actually in this book, but we may have one in this one. So just to show you quickly a little bit of difference, this book here had a whole bunch of illustrations. This one is a lot more text heavy, but it also has a bunch of pictures rather than illustrations. And while this one doesn't have a bibliography, it does have, for example, a list of the most notable weapons collections in different countries. So what's useful about this level of books, and these are going to be really invaluable for you as a beginner, is that they enable you to look at a bunch of different weapons, compare them, read about them without having to scroll through different forums, different threads, different websites, different platforms, and filtering out information from, you know, joke posts or that kind of stuff. So here you get to get a quick introduction that's usually quite professionally done. It's written by someone who knows their craft. You get to compare a bunch of different swords really easily, for instance, as in this case, and you usually get lexicon information, as I mentioned, and in this case, for example, you'll get either a basic bibliography, so that will give you more steps to build your library upon, or it will give you more information like names of other researchers, or in this case, names of notable collections. So first step, absolutely pick up some of these. You may outgrow these really quickly. So make sure you have them at the start of your collection, because when you start looking into the rest of the bibliography or library we're looking at now, these may become a little bit redundant, or at least not sufficient anymore for your needs. What comes next are probably the cornerstones of most sword-related libraries. And in this case, you'll see I'm holding here a rather thick volume, which is Storia dell'Arma Bianca Italiana by Cesare Calamandrei. And these are basically the Bibles for a lot of regional or country-specific swords and weapons. So in this case, Calamandrei has spent his life researching Italian edged weapons, and this is, well, his life's work in a sense. You'll find equivalents for these books for most countries. So for example, for France, you'll have Michel Petard, but basically any country or region that produced a vast amount of swords or has a sword or edged weapon culture will have its own big reference book. And these will vary a lot, of course. So in the case of Calamandrei's, I have some trouble holding it up, but you'll have, oh, and I'm losing pieces there, but you'll have subdivisions. In this case, there's a chapter about daggers. You'll have pictures, you'll have different models, variations. You will often also find extracts from documentation from the time. So for example, patterns from the 19th century, regulations, and all kinds of the most detailed information you probably will find in a general overview you'll find in these kinds of books. Not to mention, you'll usually have a rather rich bibliography here, so you'll have a whole bunch of more references, more detailed references you can look into if you need to research any specific sword or time or regulation or pattern. And this is basically the first really valuable kind of reference book. So if you're writing an article, if you're writing a blog post or whatever, if you can reference something from these kinds of books, you know that that information is the golden standard usually. Now, I'm saying this, these authors make mistakes as well. They're people. So even in the best books, there are going to be perhaps things that weren't known at the time of writing. So don't take anything as absolute gospel, but these are as close as you can get. As you move forward in your collection and you start having a good, solid knowledge base of different swords and different times and everything, you might start specializing in specific types of swords or specific geographic locations or specific short time periods or conflicts, for example. And in most of these cases, you'll find that you have specific literature for these. So for example, this is a small book. It's only about fascina messers. So it's in German, of course. So another thing I should mention here is you will likely have to learn to find your way in different languages, because the books about the things you want to learn about aren't always in the language you speak. So this one, for example, is German, which is a language I don't speak. But of course, thanks to Google Translate and a little bit of getting used to lexicon and different words, you can make your way through a book. So what you'll see here is a very interesting book. He has actually a few pages for every different model of the Fascina-Messer, with a bunch of detailed pictures of hilts, of blades, inscriptions, different models. So if you're really into Fascina-Messers, this is the kind of book that you absolutely need. The good thing about this one specifically is that it's a small book. It's not very expensive if you find it. So extra specificity or extra depth in your collection of books doesn't necessarily mean you have to break the bank. It can be something really easy and cheap. On the other end of the specialized books, we will have something like this. This isn't related so much to a specific kind of sword as it is to a manufacturing location, which is Potsdam. And this book, of course, if you're into Potsdam-made blades, is something you need to have. But you'll realize that as you move into your collection, you'll want to have information about, like, more detailed information that can be found in this kind of specialized books. So what you'll see here is a lovely collection of images. There, about half the book, I think, is black and white and a few color plates. You'll see different swords that are shown in different variants of each model, in different kind of positions and details. And you'll also see that each model of these swords has a very rich chapter to it that is full of detail, full of like patterns, regulations of the time. It's full of really, really important information if you're trying to find detailed information that you wouldn't be able to find probably anywhere else. And what I mean by detailed information in this case is, for example, tables like this, where you find the variation of maker's mark, of Potsdam maker's mark, that is attributed to each different model of sword in the different time frames they may appear. This is really, really important when the time comes for you to try identifying swords yourself, or to kind of get a deep understanding of what you're looking at, or what you're studying, or what you own. So far we saw three typologies, we can say. They're the beginner generic books that are really important at the start of your career as a collector. The second is the Bible books, we could call them, the really important general reference books for certain regions. The third are sword-specific or time-specific or location-specific books. So these are more in-depth studies of a specific kind of field you may be interested in. Now, there's one more category of book that is really valuable and important. The problem with these is that they can be hard to find because these are auction catalogs. So a lot of auction houses, especially the ones that specialize in antique weapons and armor, will usually publish catalogs of their auctions. And in some cases, these are more of a list of the different lots, but this becomes really important as time goes by, because you have you build a massive reference library with, if you can check out 50 different Schiavonas that went for auction in the last 10 years, that gives you a lot of knowledge and information around how patterns of Schiavonas look. And this may not be available, for example, online. But in some cases, as in the case of this one, you also have a lot of, this one has about 30 pages, all describing and going into the details of the history of the swords that went at auction, so their provenance, but also the history of the models, and it's information that may not really be available anywhere else. So if you participate in an auction, try to make sure you get a catalog, and lots of times you can find these then on the secondhand market. A fifth category of book I want to mention here is catalogs of collections. So we saw in one of the first books there was a list of notable collections, and what this means, these aren't necessarily notable private collections that the author is listing, although they might be, but they may be collections you're quite familiar with even as a beginner sword collector. So they might be the Wallace collection, the collection in the Stiebert Museum in Florence, for example, and many others, of course. In many cases, these institutions published catalogs of their collection. So you'll see here is the catalog of the Wallace collection. In many cases, these collections, by the way, are quite old. So I think this one was published in 1962. So they're not mass-produced. You can't just go on Amazon and find it. That's not to say it's hard to find, but it requires a little bit of wanting to get it. This is really a kind of book for the researcher. So what you'll find here, for example, is a complete list of the weapons in the Wallace collection in this case, with a description of their, for example, markings and inscriptions, provenance perhaps, probable provenance. You'll find references to similar weapons in the collection. So for example, if a sword has 2 or 3 swords that are similar or from a similar production facility or whatever, they're mentioned in the description, so you can quickly reference weapons within the book. They have, of course, plates. So let me see if why can't I find them? Here we go. So they have plates. These plates don't cover all of the swords, so it's not a perfect book. It's a selection of the weapons. Not all of them are represented here. But what's perhaps more useful and absolutely invaluable here are the tables of markings, for example. So lots of times your markings aren't standardized, especially as you go further back in the past. You may have many variations. And here you have, for example, if you check out here, we have the Passau wolf. We have a whole bunch of different variations of Passau wolf that are present in the Wallace collection. This can be really important in dating a sword, but even in understanding the kind of complexity and variations of a mark. But then we have, for instance, tools that make search really easy. So there's a general index where we have a bunch of names that we can look up and reference within the text. We also have a very rich bibliography. So for instance, these are the works of reference, and you'll see that they cover 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, I can't even count them all. They're probably about 30 pages of works of reference. So this is really, really like, it opens up a huge amount of doors for your deep diving into whatever research you may want to do. These can be expensive, but they're not going to break the bank usually if you're patient enough to find one that is within your budget. In my case, I actually found it for a really good price, I think. It has some damage from moisture, but it's overall perfectly fine. I cannot recommend these kinds of books enough. I have this one personally in terms of catalogs, and the one from the Stiebert Museum as well. These are absolutely reference books that I keep going back to time and time again because of the information they have. Swords can be also a big part of books that aren't specifically about swords. So here I can show you this one, which is Armi e Armature Lombarde. This is again an Italian book, and it's a book about weapons and armor from Lombardia region in Italy. So these are really beautiful books to have because they're really rich in, let me see if I can show you, but they're really rich in beautiful images and photos. And these are usually curated or written by really experienced scholars. So in the case of this one, I think it was written or curated by Giorgio Lionello Boccia, who is perhaps one of the biggest names in antique weapons in Italy. He was the curator or the director of the Stiebert Museum, I think in the 60s or 70s. So you know that the information that you will find here is absolutely first class. In some cases, these books focus more on the images rather than, they may not have all of the marking database, so to speak. They may not have deep dives into specific swords as we saw with the catalog of the Wallace collection. But they're still amazing books. You can find all kinds of detailed references. Okay, now by chance I'm only opening armor, so I'm not showing any swords, but I can assure you there are some swords here as well. Actually, let me find one for you, just so you know I'm telling the truth. They're out of print. They've been out of print often for decades, so these aren't books that you will hear for example. So you'll see quick descriptions. As I mentioned, these books, it depends. Some are really more photo-based. Some have a lot of text as well that can help you navigate what you're looking at. But as you grow more experienced, these can also be invaluable tools to look at details and figure out things that you want to know about swords. One last category of book I have here that I want to show you is a kind of book that moves away from swords kind of completely. And they're books around context. So, of course, we collect swords, and everyone collects them for their own reasons. But in my experience, what I have seen so far is that many collectors are also interested in the historical context in which the swords they own or want operated or were used. And so we have a bunch of books that are useful, like history books or military specific books that are useful to understand the context in which the swords are used. So in this case, I'm just showing you one of them. This is the Mounted Troops of the British Army. So of course it covers a specific time frame. It's not the whole history of the British Army. But you'll see, for example, at the back, you have some examples of uniforms. And this can really help give a lot of it can really help you place the objects you're looking at into their living and kind of into the actual experience of how they were used. So you'll see this book here, for example, here has plates with how troops were set up for parade, for example, in this case, which also have graphs and stuff on how they were used in battle. You have a lot of representation of different uniforms and different officers and troops. So it can really help you kind of place the piece of steel in a historical context. So this is what I wanted to show you. There are, of course, a whole bunch of other resources. There are books that are equally important about rapiers or small swords. So I'm thinking about Norman's typology, for example. And there are also resources that are only online. So this kind of goes against what I just said. But I want to take a moment here to mention La Sciabola. This is a book by Matt Ford. He's, well, I'll share the link in the description. And he just has, I'll talk about it in a future video as well, because just a quick mention doesn't really do it enough justice, I think. But you also have a whole wave of new content, new research coming out. So what I've mentioned here is kind of the old dusty things that are still really crucial to you as a collector, most likely. But keep in mind that the environment is developing and growing, and there are people who are really invested in research, really invested in communication, really invested in kind of spreading knowledge of swords to more and more people as far as possible. So I hope this was useful. If you don't have your library yet, I hope it was interesting if you already do. And tune in for the next sword video soon, and I'll see you soon.